In the early winter of 1935, on a crowded sidewalk along Lenox Avenue in Harlem, a pregnant woman was shoved to the pavement by three men wearing expensive wool coats. The woman's name was Mayme Johnson. The men worked for Dutch Schultz, the most feared bootlegger in New York City. Within 48 hours, two of those men would vanish from the streets entirely. The third would appear at a known policy bank on 145th Street, asking to speak with someone he'd previously threatened to kill. His hands were shaking. What happened in those 48 hours wasn't reported in newspapers. No police reports were filed. No bodies were found. But everyone in Harlem's underworld understood that a line had been crossed, and that Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson had responded in a way that redefined the rules of engagement in the most densely populated black neighborhood in America. This isn't a story about a gang war. It's about the moment when a 28-year-old numbers runner demonstrated that control doesn't require headlines. Power doesn't need witnesses. And respect, once lost, can never be negotiated back. By the time Mayme Johnson returned to her apartment that evening, her husband already knew what had happened. By the following morning, Dutch Schultz's men were making inquiries about how to apologize without appearing weak. By the third day, the hierarchy of Harlem's criminal underground had quietly reorganized itself. The woman survived. The pregnancy continued. But the incident set into motion a chain of events that would influence organized crime in New York for the next 3 decades. Because when you touch a man's family in front of witnesses, you're not just threatening him. You're testing whether he has the capacity to respond in a way that makes future threats unnecessary. Bumpy Johnson passed that test, and the men who failed to understand this paid a price that was never officially recorded, but universally remembered. To understand what happened on Lenox Avenue requires understanding Harlem in the mid-1930s. This wasn't the Harlem of rent parties and jazz clubs that tourists imagined. This was a neighborhood of 237,000 people compressed into less than 2 square miles, where the unemployment rate among black residents exceeded 50%, and where legitimate economic opportunity was systematically denied through redlining, discriminatory hiring, and violent enforcement of racial boundaries. The numbers game, also called policy, was the economic engine of Harlem's underground economy. By 1935, historians estimate that Harlem residents were spending between $30 million and $100 million annually on numbers betting. That's between $680 million and $2.2 billion in today's currency, flowing through a parallel financial system that employed thousands of runners, collectors, bankers, and enforcers. The game was simple. You picked a 3-digit number. If your number matched the last 3 digits of the day's total handle at a designated racetrack, you won. The payout was typically 600 to 1 on a successful bet. The odds of winning were 1,000 to 1. The difference was profit, and that profit built empires. For decades, the numbers game in Harlem had been controlled by black operators, prominent among them Stephanie St. Clair, known as Madam Queen. These bankers employed local people, reinvested in the community, and operated under an unspoken code that respected neighborhood boundaries and family safety. By 1935, however, Dutch Schultz, a white mobster with ties to the Italian and Jewish syndicates downtown, had decided that Harlem's numbers profits were too substantial to remain in black hands. Schultz, whose real name was Arthur Flegenheimer, had built his fortune during Prohibition through bootlegging and violent territorial expansion. Born in 1901 in the Bronx, he'd accumulated a criminal record by age 17 and a reputation for brutality by 25. By 1935, with Prohibition's repeal threatening his primary revenue stream, Schultz looked north to Harlem, where millions of dollars were changing hands beyond his control. His strategy was straightforward and brutal. His men would approach independent operators, offer partnership terms that amounted to extortion, and respond to refusal with escalating violence. Collectors were beaten. Policy banks were raided. Runners who refused to work for Schultz found themselves hospitalized or worse. Stephanie St. Clair fought back, even taking out newspaper advertisements denouncing Schultz and alerting the community to his invasion. But by late 1935, Schultz controlled an estimated 80% of Harlem's numbers operations. The remaining independent operators faced a choice: submit, flee, or fight a battle they couldn't win through conventional means. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson occupied an unusual position in this landscape. Born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905, he'd arrived in Harlem at age 15, already nicknamed Bumpy for the unusual protrusions on the back of his head, rumored to be calcium deposits from an untreated injury. By his early 20s, he was working as an enforcer and numbers runner for various operators, developing a reputation for intelligence, strategic thinking, and a willingness to use violence when necessary, but restraint when possible. Unlike many street-level enforcers, Bumpy read extensively, studied political theory, and understood that power in Harlem couldn't be sustained through fear alone. He cultivated relationships with local ministers, business owners, and community leaders, positioning himself not merely as a criminal, but as a figure who protected neighborhood interests against outside exploitation. This philosophy put him in direct conflict with Dutch Schultz's invasion strategy. And by early 1935, Bumpy had aligned himself with Stephanie St. Clair and the remaining independent operators, working to resist Schultz's takeover through strategic disruptions, intelligence gathering, and selective demonstrations of force. But Schultz's organization was massive, well-funded, and ruthlessly efficient. By the winter of 1935, resistance seemed increasingly futile. Then Mayme Johnson was pushed to the pavement on Lenox Avenue, and the calculation changed. Mamie Hatcher met Bumpy Johnson in 1934 at a club on 7th Avenue. She was 24 years old, recently arrived from North Carolina, educated, and employed as a secretary in a legitimate business downtown. By her own later accounts, published decades after these events, she was unaware of Bumpy's reputation when they first met. She knew him as a well-dressed, articulate man who discussed literature and current events with unexpected sophistication. Their relationship developed quickly. By early 1935, they were married in a private ceremony attended by fewer than 20 people. The marriage was strategic for Bumpy, not because Mamie brought connections or wealth, but because she represented something he'd been systematically denied: legitimacy. She wasn't part of the street life. She had no criminal record. She embodied the respectability that Bumpy understood was essential for long-term influence in the community. By late 1935, Mamie was pregnant with their first child, and this pregnancy represented more than personal joy. In the tight social networks of Harlem, where reputation and respect formed the currency of power, an attack on a pregnant wife wasn't merely a personal insult. It was a public declaration that a man couldn't protect his own family, and therefore couldn't protect anything else. Dutch Schultz's men understood this calculation. What they failed to understand was how Bumpy would respond. The incident itself was witnessed by at least 7 people, according to accounts compiled from later interviews and biographical research. Mamie was walking east on 135th Street, approaching Lenox Avenue, carrying packages from local shops. 3 men intercepted her at the corner. One of them, later identified as a collector named William Billy Harrison, spoke to her directly. "Tell your husband we own this street now. Tell him to stay out of St. Clair's business, or next time you won't just fall down." Then he pushed her. Mamie, pregnant and off balance, fell backwards onto the sidewalk. The packages scattered. One witness, a shopkeeper named Samuel Roberts, would later describe the scene in an interview conducted in the 1970s. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just sat there on that cold pavement, looking at those men with an expression I'll never forget. It wasn't fear. It was something colder than that. The 3 men walked away laughing. Multiple witnesses helped Mamie to her feet. Someone retrieved her packages. Someone else asked if she needed a doctor. Mamie declined, thanked the witnesses, and walked home to her apartment on 122nd Street. But here's what the witnesses didn't see. Within minutes of Mayme's return home, a young runner named James Coleman was dispatched to locate Bumpy, who was at a policy bank on 147th Street conducting business with Stephanie St. Clair. Coleman delivered the message in front of 6 people. Bumpy's response, according to Coleman's account given decades later, was unervingly calm. He asked 3 questions. Is she hurt? Does she need a doctor? Did anyone see who did it? Coleman answered, she says she's fine. She doesn't want a doctor. 7 people saw it. They know the names. Bumpy nodded, finished his business with St. Clair, and walked out. What happened next was never fully documented. But here's what is known. Bumpy made 5 stops that evening. He spoke with witnesses. He confirmed identities. He made phone calls from 3 different locations. He sent messages to at least a dozen people. He did not go home until after midnight. And when he arrived, he told Mayme that the situation was handled. She asked what that meant. According to her later memoir, Bumpy responded, "It means you'll never see those men again, and neither will anyone who matters." What happened between that Tuesday evening and Thursday afternoon remains partially obscured by the deliberate opacity that characterized professional criminal operations in 1930s Harlem. But through collected accounts, police records, and later testimony, a pattern emerges that reveals not chaos, but orchestration. Billy Harrison, the man who pushed Mayme, lived in a boarding house on 142nd Street. He was 31 years old, originally from Philadelphia, with a criminal record including assault and extortion. He worked as a collector for Dutch Schultz's numbers operation, which meant he visited dozens of locations daily, carrying substantial amounts of cash and operating without consistent backup. On Wednesday morning, Harrison failed to appear at his first scheduled collection point. By Wednesday afternoon, his supervisor, a man named Thomas Delaney, was making inquiries. By Wednesday evening, Delaney was sufficiently concerned to report Harrison's absence to higher-level management in Schultz's organization. This was unusual. Collectors missing appointments typically meant one of 2 things: theft or capture. Either way, it demanded immediate investigation. But here's what made the situation particularly unsettling to Schultz's organization. Nothing else was wrong. No money was missing from the previous day's collections. No policy banks had been robbed. No runners had been attacked. The numbers operation was continuing exactly as it had before, with one exception. Billy Harrison had vanished. The second man, whose name appears in historical records as Joseph Carter, was a backup collector who'd been present during the incident on Lenox Avenue. Carter lived with his sister in a tenement on 145th Street. On Wednesday evening, he told his sister he was going to meet someone about the Tuesday situation. He said he'd be back within an hour. He never returned. His sister waited until Thursday morning before reporting him missing to Schultz's organization. She specifically mentioned the Tuesday situation, assuming Schultz's men would understand the reference. They did. The third man, Samuel Garrett, was younger than the other 2, only 23 years old, and newer to Schultz's operation. Unlike Harrison and Carter, Garrett wasn't present when Mayme was pushed, but he'd been seen laughing about the incident at a speakeasy on Wednesday evening, joking that Bumpy Johnson's wife got a message delivered. By Thursday morning, Garrett was terrified, because by Thursday morning, the pattern was obvious. 2 men directly involved in the incident had disappeared, and the method of their disappearance, the complete absence of evidence, witnesses, or conventional criminal traces, suggested something more sophisticated than street violence. It suggested systematic planning. It suggested that someone with substantial resources and strategic intelligence was sending a message that would be understood by everyone except the police. On Thursday afternoon, Samuel Garrett walked into a policy bank on 145th Street controlled by Stephanie St. Clair. He asked to speak with someone connected to Bumpy Johnson. He was sweating despite the cold weather. According to the banker present, a woman named Ella Thompson who gave an interview in the 1980s, Garrett's exact words were, "I need to apologize. I need this to stop. I wasn't even there, but I need to apologize. Thompson told him to wait. 30 minutes later, a man appeared. Not Bumpy Johnson, but someone who spoke with authority. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Garrett was told that his apology was noted, that he would not be harmed, but that he needed to leave Harlem immediately and permanently. Garrett agreed. He left New York within 48 hours and, according to later tracking by researchers, never returned. But the real demonstration of power wasn't Garrett's terror. It was what happened next with Dutch Schultz's organization. Dutch Schultz, despite his reputation for violence and impulsive decision-making, was not stupid. By Thursday evening, he understood that 2 of his men had been disappeared by someone with the capacity to act invisibly, and that a 3rd man was so frightened he'd abandoned his position and fled the city. More importantly, Schultz understood that this had happened without any disruption to his business operations, without any police involvement, and without any public spectacle that might attract unwanted attention from law enforcement or rival organizations. This was not the work of a street gang retaliating emotionally. This was the work of someone demonstrating controlled, strategic power. On Friday morning, December 13th, 1935, according to multiple historical accounts, a meeting was requested between representatives of Dutch Schultz's organization and Stephanie St. Clair's operation. The meeting was held at a neutral location, a restaurant on 125th Street, that served as occasional diplomatic ground for underworld negotiations. Bumpy Johnson attended. So did Stephanie St. Clair. Representing Schultz were 2 senior members of his organization, Thomas Delaney, who'd been Billy Harrison's supervisor, and a lawyer named Richard Davis who handled legal and negotiation matters for the Schultz operation. The meeting lasted approximately 90 minutes. What was discussed was never officially recorded, but multiple participants gave accounts years later that align on key points. Schultz's representatives opened by acknowledging that an unfortunate incident had occurred, that discipline would be maintained within their organization, and that respect for boundaries was essential for continued business operations. This was as close as Schultz's organization would come to an apology. Stephanie St. Clair responded by outlining terms for coexistence. Schultz could maintain his current operations in designated territories, but several specific streets and policy banks would remain under independent control. Collectors working for Schultz would be prohibited from direct intimidation of family members of independent operators. Violations would result in appropriate responses. The language was careful, diplomatic, and backed by the unspoken reality of what had happened to Harrison and Carter. Davis, the lawyer, asked a direct question: "What happened to our men?" According to accounts, Bumpy Johnson responded personally. His answer, as reported decades later, was precise. "They're not in Harlem. They're not in New York. They won't be found. This is what happens when someone touches my family. This is what will always happen." There was no threat in his voice, according to witnesses. No anger. No emotion at all. Just information. Davis asked if there would be retaliation from Schultz. Stephanie St. Clair answered this time. "If there's retaliation, it won't stop with 2 men. It'll spread through your entire operation in Harlem, 1 person at a time, until either Mr. Schultz accepts these terms or he has no operation left to protect." The meeting ended with a tentative agreement. Schultz's organization would maintain most of its territorial gains, but would recognize specific boundaries and restrictions. Independent operators would not actively resist Schultz's dominance in agreed-upon territories, but would defend their designated areas. It wasn't peace. It was a ceasefire negotiated through demonstrated capacity for invisible violence. And it held, more or less, for the next year. If you've made it this far into this story, you're exactly the kind of person who appreciates history that isn't sanitized or simplified. Consider subscribing, because the stories we tell here don't show up in textbooks, but they shape the cities we live in today. The question that haunted Dutch Schultz's organization, and that continues to intrigue historians, is simple. What actually happened to Billy Harrison and Joseph Carter? No bodies were ever found. No missing persons reports were filed with the NYPD. No evidence of foul play ever emerged in any official investigation. The two men simply ceased to exist in any documented form after December 10th, 1935. Several theories have been proposed over the decades. The first theory, popular among sensational accounts, suggests that Harrison and Carter were killed and their bodies disposed of in ways that prevented discovery. The Hudson River, remote areas of New Jersey, and construction sites were all suggested as possible locations. This theory aligns with conventional understanding of gangland violence in the 1930s. The second theory, supported by some historical researchers, proposes that the men were paid or coerced to leave New York permanently, with the implicit threat that return would result in death. This theory better explains the complete absence of physical evidence and the theatrical precision of their disappearance. The third theory, perhaps most intriguing, suggests a combination: that Harrison and Carter were taken to a secondary location, held for a period of time to ensure their disappearance was noticed and understood, then released far from New York with sufficient resources to start elsewhere and sufficient fear never to return. What supports this third theory is the pattern of Bumpy Johnson's later career. Throughout the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, Johnson developed a reputation not primarily for murder, but for strategic intimidation. He was known to use violence when necessary, but to prefer demonstrations of power that achieved objectives without creating the investigative attention that homicides inevitably attracted. In a 1963 interview with Amsterdam News, conducted shortly after one of his prison releases, Bumpy was asked about his reputation for making people disappear. His response was carefully worded. "People leave New York all the time. Sometimes they leave because they want to. Sometimes they leave because staying would be a worse choice. I've never stopped anyone from leaving." This wasn't a confession. It was a philosophical statement about power and choice. What is certain is that the disappearance of Harrison and Carter accomplished multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. First, it demonstrated to Dutch Schultz's organization that Bumpy Johnson had resources, intelligence networks, and operational capabilities that exceeded what a street-level enforcer should possess. Second, it communicated that violence against family members would result in consequences that couldn't be prevented by organizational size or political connections. Third, it created psychological uncertainty within Schultz's ranks. If two men could vanish without trace, then anyone could. This undermined internal cohesion and made collectors and enforcers more cautious about aggressive tactics in contested territories. Fourth, it avoided the investigative attention that conventional murders would have triggered. No bodies meant no homicide detectives, no newspaper coverage, no political pressure on police to solve high-profile crimes. And finally, it established Bumpy Johnson, at age 30, as a significant power in Harlem's underworld, someone who couldn't be dismissed as merely Stephanie St. Clair's enforcer. Within 6 months, this reputation would prove crucial, because in October 1935, Dutch Schultz was assassinated by Murder Incorporated, the enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate, on orders from Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky. Schultz's death created a power vacuum in Harlem's numbers operations, and the question became, who would fill it? The answer was determined, in part, by what had happened on Lenox Avenue 10 months earlier. Mayme Johnson gave birth to a healthy daughter in April 1936. The pregnancy, despite the fall on Lenox Avenue, proceeded without complications. The child was named Ruthie, and she would grow up largely shielded from her father's street activities, attending good schools and eventually leaving Harlem for a quieter life. But the incident that preceded her birth had consequences that extended far beyond one family. In the months following Dutch Schultz's assassination in October 1935, Harlem's numbers operations underwent significant reorganization. The Italian and Jewish syndicates downtown, led by Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, sought to maintain Schultz's territorial gains while implementing more sophisticated management structures. They needed local operators who understood Harlem's networks, who had community credibility, and who could maintain operations without constant violent conflict. Bumpy Johnson became one of those operators. By 1936, he was managing numbers operations across multiple territories, working in cooperation with both the downtown syndicates and remaining independent black operators like Stephanie St. Clair. He was pulling in substantial income, establishing legitimate business fronts, and developing political connections that would protect his operations for decades. But more significantly, the incident on Lenox Avenue had established an unwritten rule that would govern organized crime in Harlem for the next generation. Family was off limits. This wasn't morality. It was strategic pragmatism. When family members became targets, responses became unpredictable and disproportionate. Men who might negotiate over territory or money became uncompromising when wives, children, or parents were threatened. The resulting violence was bad for business, attracted police attention, and destabilized profitable operations. The rule was tested occasionally. In 1938, a collector working for an Italian crew made threatening remarks to the wife of an independent operator. Within 24 hours, the collector was hospitalized with injuries that ended his career. The Italian crew's leadership apologized and fired the collector. The rule held. In 1942, during a territorial dispute in the Bronx, someone burglarized the home of a numbers banker while his family was present. 3 men were subsequently found beaten severely enough to require hospitalization. The burglaries stopped. The rule held. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, as Bumpy Johnson's influence expanded and his relationship with Italian and Jewish organized crime became more formalized, the principle that families remained outside the operational conflict became institutionalized across New York's underworld. This wasn't universal, and it wasn't always enforced, but it was understood. And when it was violated, the response was swift and severe enough to discourage repetition. Bumpy Johnson himself would spend significant portions of the 1940s and 1950s in prison on various charges, mostly narcotics-related. He would serve time in Sing Sing, in Alcatraz, and in various federal institutions. But his reputation, established in part by the events of December 1935, ensured that his operations continued during his absences, that his territory was maintained by loyal associates, and that his eventual releases were treated as significant events in Harlem's power structure. He died in 1968 of a heart attack at age 62, still active in Harlem street life, still respected, still feared. Mayme Johnson outlived him by nearly 40 years, passing away in 2009 at age 94. In her later years, she gave numerous interviews about her husband, about Harlem in its heyday, and about the incident on Lenox Avenue. Her account was always carefully worded, neither confirming nor denying the details of what happened in those 48 hours in December 1935. When asked directly if Bumpy had killed the men who pushed her, Mayme's response, given in a 1998 interview, was revealing, "I don't know what happened to those men. I know I never saw them again. I know nobody in Harlem ever saw them again. I know that after that day, nobody ever disrespected me on the street. And I know my husband told me I was safe, and I believed him." That belief, that certainty of protection, was perhaps the real point of the entire episode. Because power in the world Bumpy Johnson inhabited wasn't measured by how many people you killed. It was measured by how many people believed you could kill them and chose not to test that belief. The incident on Lenox Avenue wasn't about revenge. It was about establishing certainty. And in Harlem, in 1935, in a neighborhood where certainty was rare and trust was currency, that demonstration was worth more than territory, more than money, more than headlines. It was worth respect, and respect, once earned through decisive action, became the foundation for everything that followed.